How do you truly recognize the collapse of an empire? Most people look for the obvious Hollywood-style signs: a definitive military defeat on a distant, dusty battlefield, the sudden shrinking of borders on a map, or a visible, violent coup in the capital city. But history, real history, teaches us something far more profound and chilling. The true indicator of terminal decline is not the loss of a particular war, but the absolute loss of the ability to maintain peace. When an empire reaches a point where it can no longer afford peace as a functional option, when stability itself becomes an existential threat to its internal mechanics, that empire has already begun to fall. Peace for a healthy nation is the goal of all policy. But for a declining giant, peace is a poison. It is a moment of reckoning that the system is no longer equipped to survive. Today, we are witnessing a systemic struggle for survival that transcends traditional politics, party lines, or individual leaders. We are watching the American economic engine, a machine once built on the solid ground of innovation, production, and a middle-class dream, reach a state where it is no longer designed to function in peacetime. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It is a structural, biological reality of the current system. It has become a necessity for this apparatus to exist in a state of perpetual crisis. If we look at the hard, cold data from the last 75 years, a haunting and undeniable pattern emerges. Every single time the United States has attempted to reduce military spending or pursue what was once optimistically called a peace dividend, the economy has stumbled, choked, and threatened to stop entirely. Look at the post-Vietnam recession. Look at the stagnation following the end of the Cold War in the early 90s. Look at the brief, fragile lull before the tragedy of 9/11. The message from the global markets and domestic indices has been clear. Without the massive, violent infusion of capital that only a war footing can justify, the American domestic economy cannot sustain its own weight. This addiction to conflict is rooted in a staggering, often invisible employment reality. Approximately 25 million jobs, ranging from direct personnel in the Department of Defense to defense contractors, weapons manufacturers, and the sprawling service and logistics industries that support them, rely entirely on the military-industrial complex. We are talking about nearly 15% of the total American workforce. In this context, peace is not a noble diplomatic goal. It is an economic catastrophe. It is a mass unemployment event that would dwarf the Great Depression. This is why the system must constantly invent, inflate, or provoke a new enemy. It is the only way to keep the printing presses running, to justify the creation of trillions of dollars out of thin air, and to prevent a domestic collapse that would lead to total social upheaval. But the rot goes much deeper than just jobs and manufacturing. The global hegemony of the US dollar, the very foundation of what many call American unearned privilege, no longer rests on the nation's industrial productivity or its moral authority. It rests almost exclusively on the military power to enforce it. The petrodollar and the dollar's status as the global reserve currency are protected by carrier strike groups and stealth bombers, not by a balanced ledger or a healthy trade surplus. The world is changing. As nations begin to shift toward alternative systems, exemplified by the rapid rise of the BRICS alliance and the accelerating move toward bilateral trade in local currencies, the enforcement mechanism of the dollar is being directly challenged. When Russia was cut off from the SWIFT system, it wasn't just a move against one nation. It was a signal to the world that the dollar is now a weapon. And once a currency becomes a weapon, it loses its status as a neutral medium of exchange. To maintain the dollar's dominance, Washington now feels it must prove that the alternative, defying the dollar, is more painful than the inflation caused by staying within it. This requires tension. This requires fire. This brings us to a critical psychological and strategic concept, the law of proximity. In the 20th century, we assumed the primary game was played between nations, the US versus the USSR. But the more proximate, more dangerous game today is the one being played within nations. In Washington, we are seeing a brutal civil conflict between what we call the established elites, the old guard who benefit from the globalist, financialized status quo, and the counter-elites, the new faction representing a more nationalist, tech-driven, and populist vision. This internal friction triggers the phenomenon of elite overproduction. There are simply too many people competing for too few positions of ultimate power. To survive this internal civil war, both factions find themselves forced to project strength externally. You cannot be seen as weak on China or soft on Russia when you are fighting for your political life at home. Washington now finds itself in a position where it cannot back down in Ukraine, Taiwan, or Iran. To blink, to compromise, or to genuinely de-escalate would mean an immediate domestic collapse of credibility. The fear factor that keeps the dollar system afloat would evaporate overnight. What we are witnessing is a historic, almost tectonic transition. The shift from a secular liberal democracy to a nationalist, almost theocratic empire. In this new era, war is no longer viewed through the lens of Clausewitz as a strategic tool to achieve a specific political end. Instead, it is being reframed as a spiritual necessity. It is seen as a cleansing fire required for national survival and moral redemption. This is why we see the pursuit of maximalist objectives. The era of limited war, of proxy conflicts with clear exit ramps, is over. The goal now is the total decapitation of rival leadership and the systematic destruction of the enemy's capacity to function as a coherent nation state. When you target pragmatic foreign leaders, the very individuals who could sit at a negotiating table, you are intentionally destroying the off-ramps for diplomacy. You are burning the bridges behind you. The establishment is ensuring that the only way out is through. This is a desperate gamble to maintain a unipolar world at any cost. Whether it involves pulling nuclear-armed powers like Pakistan into the fray by activating mutual defense treaties, or systematically targeting global energy infrastructure in Qatar or the Persian Gulf, the objective is the same: to create a crisis so large, so global, and so terrifying that the world has no choice but to return to the protection of the American umbrella. The tragedy of our time is that the current establishment would rather risk a catastrophic global conflict or even a tactical nuclear exchange than accept a diminished role in a multipolar reality. They view a world they do not lead as a world not worth inhabiting. This is the God complex of a declining hegemon. They see the rise of China and the independence of the global South not as a natural evolution of history, but as an affront to the rules-based order, an order where they write the rules and give the orders. We are currently watching the final major move of a declining giant. The assassination of negotiators, the rejection of ceasefires, and the provocation of energy-rich regions are not signs of strength. They are the frantic, uncoordinated thrashing of a system that knows its time is running out. This is a death spiral. In a death spiral, escalation is the only perceived solution to the problems created by previous escalations. As the conflict expands into the Zagros Mountains, into the South China Sea, and across the plains of Eastern Europe, we must realize that the battlefield is a distraction. The real crisis is the bankruptcy, both financial and moral, of the imperial center. The center cannot hold because it has hollowed itself out. It has offshored its production, devalued its currency, and alienated its allies. One of the most disturbing signs of this collapse is the celebration of destruction. When we see religious and political factions within allied states welcoming the fire, viewing it as a precursor to a messianic age or a great reset, we are no longer in the realm of geopolitics. We are in the realm of eschatology, the study of the end of the world. When leaders stop fearing the end because they believe it brings their ultimate victory, the traditional deterrents of war, loss of life, economic ruin, no longer work. This is the most dangerous moment in human history. We have 21st century weapons in the hands of leaders operating with 19th century imperial ambitions and 17th century religious fervency. The gap between our technological power and our social wisdom has become a chasm. The empire is not falling because it is being attacked from the outside. It is falling because it can no longer stand the weight of its own shadow. It is collapsing under the pressure of its own debts, its own internal contradictions, and its own refusal to adapt to a world that wants to be multipolar. Understanding these structural warning signs is not just an academic exercise in history. It is the first and most critical step towards surviving the chaotic transition into the world that comes next. We must stop looking at these conflicts as isolated events. The strike in Qatar, the missiles over Tel Aviv, the tension in the Taiwan Strait, they are all symptoms of the same disease, an empire that has lost the ability to afford peace. As we move forward, the briefing takeaway is simple but grim. Prepare for a decade of maximum volatility. The off-ramps are gone. The leaders are committed. The system requires the fire to keep the lights on. But remember, history does not end with the fall of an empire. It merely turns a page. The goal now is to ensure that when that page is turned, there is still a world left to read it.